The airport lounge was buzzing with chatter, the kind that always fills the air before a late evening departure. Businessmen tapped away on laptops, families juggled restless children, and travelers shifted impatiently in their seats as the announcement board blinked with boarding updates. Among them was a man named Marcus, a well-dressed professional in his early 40s, calm and composed, with a confidence that came from years of working hard and carving out his space in the world. He had just closed a big deal overseas and was heading back home, tired but satisfied. For once, he had decided to treat himself, not to economy, not even to business, but to first class. It was expensive, yes, but he felt he had earned this comfort, a little recognition of his own worth. When boarding was called, Marcus walked with his boarding pass in hand, nodding politely to the flight attendants scanning tickets. He had traveled many times before, but there was something different about this flight. The smiles at the gate felt strained, the attendant's tone stiff, and even as he took his seat in first class, he noticed the stares. Other passengers glanced quickly and then looked away, as though they were surprised to see him there. He placed his carry-on neatly above, adjusted his suit, and settled into the wide leather seat, determined to ignore whatever silent judgments floated around him. But the unease didn't stop there. Within minutes, one of the flight attendants approached. She was polite, but her eyes carried something Marcus had seen too many times in his life, a subtle suspicion, a quiet disbelief that he belonged where he was sitting. She asked to see his boarding pass again, as though doubting he had the right ticket. Marcus handed it over calmly, even smiled, though inside he felt that old sting of being questioned where others would not. She glanced at the pass, forced a smile, and returned it to him, without apology. He tried to let it go, to focus on the flight ahead, but a knot had already formed in his chest. The engines roared, and the plane taxied onto the runway. Passengers reclined, ordered drinks, and opened magazines. Marcus closed his eyes, hoping for some peace. But that peace shattered halfway through the flight. A murmur rose from the galley, whispers passed between crew members, and soon 2 attendants stood over Marcus. Their words were clipped, this time, without the thin veneer of politeness. "Sir, you'll need to move to the back. There's been an error with your ticket." Marcus opened his eyes slowly, staring at them in disbelief. "An error? No, this is my seat. I paid for this. You checked my pass already." But the attendants were unmoved. One repeated herself firmly, her voice louder now, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "Sir, you need to move. Other passengers have complained. Please don't make this difficult." Confusion flooded Marcus's face. Complained? About what? He had been sitting quietly, minding his own business. His voice shook, not from fear, but from controlled anger. "I'm not moving. This is my seat. If there's a problem, call the captain." The attendants exchanged glances, their patience thinning. Moments later, another crew member joined them, then a fourth. The aisle filled with uniforms, all directed at Marcus, as though he were a threat. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others watched with curiosity, phones already sliding out discreetly to record. Marcus realized the weight of the situation. He was outnumbered, trapped thousands of feet in the air, facing not reason, but prejudice dressed in authority. Then came the words he would never forget. "If you don't get up voluntarily, we'll have to remove you by force." Gasps rippled through first class. Marcus held his ground. He wasn't rude, he wasn't aggressive, he simply said no. "I paid for this seat. I'm not leaving." And that was enough. What happened next unfolded in seconds, though it would be replayed millions of times in slow motion later. Hands grabbed his arms, yanking him upward. His shoulders slammed against the seat frame. His knee hit the edge of the aisle. He cried out in pain, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. Passengers shouting, crew demanding compliance, the sound of fabric tearing as he struggled to keep his dignity. His body was dragged down the aisle, his shoes scraping the floor, his head knocking against armrests. A woman screamed for them to stop, another begged them to reconsider, but the crew pressed on, their faces cold with a determination that looked less like duty and more like punishment. By the time they forced Marcus into the cramped rear of the plane, his face was swollen, his shirt torn, and his dignity shattered. He sat there in silence, staring at the floor, his breath ragged. Around him, passengers whispered, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some had filmed everything. Others shook their heads in anger. But none could erase what they had just witnessed. The flight continued in an uneasy silence, a heavy weight pressing on every passenger who had seen the injustice unfold. And though Marcus sat quietly, the storm was only beginning. Because what the crew didn't realize was that their actions had been captured on half a dozen phones, streamed online before the plane even landed. By the time the wheels touched the ground, the world was already watching. In airports across the country, screens lit up with headlines: passenger dragged from first class, airline accused of racial discrimination. Social media erupted with outrage, hashtags trending within minutes, celebrities and activists demanding answers. The airline scrambled to issue statements, weak apologies crafted by legal teams, but the images were undeniable. The sight of Marcus being dragged, his face twisted in pain, would burn itself into the memory of millions. And yet, in that moment, Marcus himself didn't know any of it. Sitting alone, bruised and humiliated, he only knew the quiet ache of being treated as less than human in a place he had every right to be. He didn't know that outside the plane, a fire was already spreading, one that would consume the very airline that had tried to silence him. The plane touched down to the usual rumble of wheels on tarmac, but the mood inside was far from normal. Passengers avoided looking at Marcus as though ashamed of what they had witnessed. The crew rushed through closing duties, stiff and curt, pretending as though nothing unusual had happened. But the truth was waiting for them the moment the cabin doors opened. Phones buzzed with notifications, feeds exploded with shares and comments, and by the time Marcus staggered off the plane, battered but upright, his name was already echoing across the internet. At first, Marcus thought it was just a few witnesses venting their anger online. He heard someone behind him mutter, "This is going viral," but he didn't fully understand what that meant in the moment. He was more concerned with the sharp ache in his ribs and the humiliation that still clung to him like a second skin. Yet by the time he reached baggage claim, strangers were approaching cautiously, whispering, "Are you the man they dragged off the flight?" He could only nod, his eyes tired, unsure of what was coming next. Meanwhile, on the other side of the airport, executives from the airline were scrambling. Within an hour, a shaky press release appeared on social media. "We regret the unfortunate incident involving one of our passengers. Safety and protocol are always our priority." It was cold, corporate, and detached. The statement didn't mention Marcus by name. It didn't acknowledge the violence. Instead, it painted the scene as though Marcus had been the problem, as though dragging a paying customer across the floor was simply procedure. But the world wasn't buying it. The video clips had already spread far beyond the airport. On Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, millions watched in disbelief as Marcus was yanked from his seat, his body dragged like luggage through the aisle. Influential voices began speaking up. Activists, athletes, actors. One tweet with a single sentence, "Imagine if this was your father," garnered 500,000 shares in less than an hour. Hashtags demanding justice for Marcus began trending worldwide. By the next morning, news anchors were replaying the footage on loop. Panels debated it live, some shaking their heads in disgust, others asking what it said about the airline industry, about race, about dignity itself. Marcus's name was no longer just Marcus. He had become a symbol, a rallying cry against injustice. Commentators drew comparisons to past incidents. Legal experts dissected potential lawsuits, and the airline's stock price began to dip sharply. But for Marcus himself, it was overwhelming. He woke up to hundreds of missed calls, texts from friends and strangers alike. His email overflowed with requests from journalists, lawyers, organizations offering support. He hadn't asked for any of it. He had only wanted to go home, to rest after a long trip, to enjoy the seat he had paid for. Now, whether he liked it or not, his life had been thrust into the center of a storm. At a hastily arranged press conference, the airline CEO appeared on screen, looking tense and defensive. Cameras flashed as he read from a prepared statement. "We are deeply sorry for the distress caused to one of our passengers. Our staff acted in accordance with procedure, but we acknowledge the optics were unfortunate." That word, unfortunate, set off another wave of fury. People didn't see the dragging of Marcus as unfortunate. They saw it as brutal, unnecessary, humiliating. The CEO's attempt to smooth things over only poured gasoline on the fire. Outside corporate offices, protesters gathered. They carried signs with Marcus's image, slogans demanding accountability. Chants filled the air. No justice, no flights. Airports across the country saw small but growing demonstrations. Travelers canceled tickets, calling customer service lines nonstop, demanding refunds. Shareholders panicked. What had begun as a single incident on a single flight was spiraling into something the airline couldn't control. Through it all, Marcus remained remarkably calm. Friends urged him to speak out, to give interviews, to tell his side of the story. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. But eventually, standing at a podium with microphones lined before him, he cleared his throat and spoke. His words were steady, not fiery, but filled with the kind of quiet strength that cuts deeper than anger. "I bought a ticket. I followed the rules. I sat in my seat. And for that, I was dragged like a criminal in front of strangers. I wasn't treated like a man. I wasn't treated like a customer. I was treated like I didn't belong." The room was silent as his words echoed. Then the applause began, not just from those present, but across millions of screens as the clip was replayed again and again. Marcus wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a voice, and people were listening. The airline tried to push back. Leaked memos suggested they were digging into Marcus's past, hoping to find anything that could discredit him. But each attempt backfired. The public saw it for what it was: character assassination, a desperate scramble to protect profits. The more they tried to smear him, the stronger the outrage grew. And then came the tipping point. A major sponsor announced they were severing ties with the airline, citing a fundamental clash of values. Others quickly followed: credit card companies, travel agencies, corporate partners. Overnight, the airline lost millions in contracts. The stock market reflected the blow, with shares plummeting further. Employees, once silent, began speaking out too, leaking stories of discrimination, toxic work culture, and pressure to prioritize revenue over passengers' rights. By the end of that week, the airline's brand was in freefall. Customers abandoned it en masse. Flights went half empty, and regulators, who had initially stayed quiet, now announced an official investigation into the airline's practices. For Marcus, it was surreal. He had gone from being dragged across a plane floor to standing at the center of a movement. Strangers sent letters of support, communities raised funds, lawyers offered to represent him pro bono. He hadn't asked for any of this, yet somehow his fight had become everyone's fight. And deep inside the airline's headquarters, panic grew. Executives argued, shareholders threatened lawsuits, and the once proud company found itself standing on the edge of collapse. What they didn't realize yet was that the collapse wasn't just coming, it was inevitable, because the people had spoken, and for once, the world was watching.
The storm that had begun with a single act of brutality was no longer just a media spectacle. It had become an unstoppable force pressing down on the airline from every angle. The video of Marcus being dragged had surpassed 50 million views. Late-night hosts mocked the airline mercilessly, comedians turning the brand name into a punchline. But for regulators and lawmakers, it was no laughing matter. Committees in Washington announced hearings. The Department of Transportation released a stern statement about reviewing systemic misconduct in passenger treatment. Civil rights organizations filed lawsuits on Marcus's behalf, joined by others who had long stayed silent about their own mistreatment by the airline. The words pattern and practice began appearing in legal briefs, signaling a deeper probe into whether this wasn't just an isolated incident, but part of a larger culture of abuse. Inside the airline's headquarters, the mood was grim. Executives gathered in hushed conference rooms, numbers flashing across screens, revenue plunging, cancellations doubling, loyalty memberships dropping like stones. The boardroom arguments were vicious. Some wanted to fire the CEO immediately and offer Marcus a massive settlement. Others insisted they could weather the storm, that the outrage would fade as the internet moved on to its next scandal. But for once, the internet didn't move on. The video was too raw, too visceral. It wasn't just a story, it was a symbol. And then came the whistleblowers. Anonymous employees began leaking internal emails, recordings of managers instructing staff to assert authority over certain passengers, even if it meant escalation. One leaked memo referred to undesirable clientele in premium cabins, a phrase that instantly set the internet ablaze. Reporters dug deeper, uncovering years of complaints ignored by higher-ups. Former flight attendants came forward saying they had been punished for questioning unfair orders. A retired pilot told journalists he had once refused to take off after seeing a passenger mistreated, only to face threats to his career. The cracks were widening, and the foundation of the airline was beginning to collapse. Marcus watched all this unfold from a distance, torn between disbelief and exhaustion. His name was now on the lips of senators, CEOs, and activists. He couldn't walk down the street without someone stopping him, to thank him, to hug him, to tell him he had given them courage. Yet he remained humble, almost reluctant, reminding everyone that he had never sought fame. He always repeated in interviews, "I just wanted to fly home." And that simple truth resonated more powerfully than any speech could. But while Marcus found support, the airline found only enemies. Shareholders filed lawsuits accusing leadership of gross negligence. Pilots and crew members began to unionize more aggressively, citing unsafe and discriminatory practices. Travel blogs published lists of alternative airlines, encouraging readers to vote with your wallet. Major cities began canceling contracts with the airline for government travel. The company was bleeding from every direction, and still it tried to defend itself. In a desperate move, the airline launched a new ad campaign. Slick commercials showed smiling passengers, diverse crews, and soft music playing under slogans about respect and family. But the public wasn't fooled. Comment sections filled with angry reminders of Marcus's bruised face, the image of him dragged down the aisle. "No ad can erase what we saw," one viral comment read. And it summed up the collective mood perfectly. But the final blow came from within. A middle-level manager, disgusted by the hypocrisy, handed over a trove of documents to investigators. Among them was a report written just weeks before Marcus's flight, warning of potentially catastrophic brand damage if discriminatory practices continued unchecked. The report had been buried, ignored by senior leaders who feared it would, quote, distract from profitability. Now in the hands of regulators and journalists, it became undeniable proof that the airline had seen this disaster coming and chose profit over people anyway. The hearings were brutal. Executives squirmed under questioning, their rehearsed answers shredded by lawmakers armed with emails and testimonies. Clips from the hearings went viral, showing stone-faced senators holding up photos of Marcus demanding accountability. The airline's CEO, once confident and dismissive, now looked pale, stammering under the weight of undeniable evidence. And all the while, Marcus remained steady. He didn't shout or gloat. When asked what justice looked like to him, he answered simply, "Justice looks like change, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever been told they don't belong where they worked hard to be." That answer became a rallying cry. People printed it on posters, painted it on murals, quoted it in speeches. Marcus had become more than a man wronged. He had become a voice demanding dignity for everyone. As the hearings dragged on, investors began to abandon ship. Creditors demanded repayment. Government fines loomed. Flight bookings plummeted to historic lows. The airline, once one of the nation's proudest, was teetering on the brink of collapse. And in boardrooms across the industry, other airlines watched with horror, realizing that if it could happen to one of them, it could happen to all of them. But for Marcus, the most surreal moment came late one night as he sat at home scrolling messages. Among the thousands of emails, one stood out. It was from a young boy whose mother had been kicked off a flight years ago for questioning her seat assignment. The boy, now a teenager, wrote, "They made us feel small. But when I saw you stand your ground, I felt proud again. Thank you for showing the world." Marcus sat in silence, tears welling in his eyes. He had never wanted to be a hero, but in the quiet of that moment, he realized his pain had sparked something larger than himself, a movement too strong to be stopped. And while the airline scrambled to salvage what little remained of its reputation, the truth was already clear. The countdown to its downfall had begun.
The writing on the wall had become impossible to ignore. The airline that once carried millions of passengers a year, that had bragged about its profits and dominance in the skies, was now collapsing in real time. Headlines screamed about plunging stock prices, canceled routes, mounting lawsuits. For travelers, it was simple. Nobody wanted to fly with a company that had dragged a man across the floor for daring to sit where he belonged. The final unraveling came swiftly. After weeks of scandal, regulators handed down their findings. The airline had engaged in systemic discrimination, violated passenger rights repeatedly, and ignored internal warnings that predicted disaster. The fines alone reached into the hundreds of millions. Lawsuits piled higher, settlements draining the company's resources. Creditors demanded immediate repayment of loans. Even aircraft lessors began pulling their planes, unwilling to be associated with the brand any longer. At the heart of it all was Marcus's story, the image of his body being pulled down that aisle, a symbol that no rebranding, no apology, no expensive commercial could erase. His face had appeared on magazine covers, his words quoted in editorials. The more the airline tried to distance itself, the more people returned to the simple truth. A paying customer had been humiliated, brutalized, and treated as disposable. Inside corporate headquarters, chaos reigned. The CEO resigned under pressure, escorted out of the building under the cover of night. Interim leaders were brought in, but by then, it was too late. Employees leaked photos of empty offices, entire floors deserted. The once bustling operations hub now looked like a ghost town. Flight attendants, pilots, and mechanics began jumping ship, signing with rival airlines. Planes sat idle on runways, their logos covered up as if hiding a scar. And then, one morning, the inevitable happened. A simple press release appeared online. Effective immediately, operations will cease. We thank our employees and passengers for their loyalty throughout the years. The airline was officially shut down. The world erupted with disbelief, then applause. Commentators called it historic, the first time a major airline had been brought to its knees, not by war, not by recession, but by its own arrogance and cruelty. Social media buzzed with celebration, memes spreading like wildfire. Dragged one man, lost millions. But beneath the humor was a deeper message, a recognition that the fall of a giant meant accountability was possible. For Marcus, the news hit differently. He didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. Sitting in his modest living room, he stared at the headline with quiet reflection. The closure didn't erase what happened to him. It didn't undo the pain or the humiliation, but it was proof that the world had listened, that his suffering hadn't been ignored or swept aside, and in that, there was a measure of justice. When reporters asked him for a final statement, he spoke with the same calm strength he had carried since the beginning. "I never wanted anyone to lose their jobs. I never wanted an airline to collapse. But dignity matters. Respect matters. If my experience reminds companies that passengers are human beings first, then maybe something good has come from something terrible." His words spread once again, carried across news outlets and social feeds. People nodded in agreement. Parents showed the clip to their children, reminding them of the importance of standing tall even when the world tries to push you down.
In the months that followed, Marcus slowly returned to his life. He continued his work, spent more time with his family, and tried to reclaim the peace that had been taken from him. Yet everywhere he went, strangers still recognized him. Some shook his hand, others simply said, "Thank you." And Marcus, as humble as ever, would smile softly and reply, "I was just trying to go home." But in truth, his story had already gone far beyond him. Universities studied the case in ethics classes. Airlines worldwide revised their policies, terrified of meeting the same fate. Advocacy groups pointed to Marcus's ordeal as proof of why accountability must be demanded at every level. His name had become part of history, not for seeking power, but for enduring injustice and refusing to be silent. On the anniversary of the incident, a mural appeared on the side of a building in his city. It showed Marcus standing tall in a suit, not dragged, not humiliated, but upright and dignified. Under the mural were words that had once slipped from his lips in a quiet press conference but had since echoed across the world. "Justice looks like change." And with the airline that had wronged him now nothing more than a memory, those words felt truer than ever. Marcus never wanted to be a symbol, but sometimes the world chooses its symbols not from the strongest or the loudest, but from those who suffer, endure, and stand tall anyway. And in his quiet way, Marcus had become just that, a reminder that dignity is worth fighting for, and that no matter how high and mighty the powerful may seem, they can fall in an instant if they forget the humanity of the people they serve. And so, while one airline disappeared from the skies forever, Marcus's story soared higher than any jet ever could, etched into memory, into history, into the conscience of a world that had finally said enough.